On the 4th of July 1946, 200,000 people in Gdansk flocked to see the executions of the former guards of Stutthof Concentration Camp. High up on the Biskupia Gorka hill, a number of women were brought out to the huge gallows that were there to take their lives. These women were found guilty of crimes against humanity, and they were some of the most evil female guards that worked for the SS inside of the concentration camp systems. They had all been found guilty after a war crimes trial, and they were known for being violent brutes and women who were happy to torture and execute. This is a story of the executions of the female guards of Stutthof Concentration Camp in full. Each of the women in this documentary were known for their brutality and evil. Join us today as we look at the executions of the female guards of Stutthof, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Stutthof Concentration Camp opened almost straight after the Second World War broke out, as the initial prisoner population was sent to the camp to establish it and build the different buildings. However, in 1944, the number of inmates at Stutthof rose sharply, and most of the newcomers were Jewish prisoners who had come from other camps such as Auschwitz. Around 24,000 prisoners were sent there from the largest concentration camp, and to deal with the sheer amount of people who were transferred, there were a number of new guards who were sent there. There were, because of this, a number of guards who were recruited to work specifically at Stutthof from the local area, and the conditions there were terrible. It was a very harsh concentration camp, and thousands of prisoners succumbed to starvation and disease, and many died from epidemics such as typhus, which took the camp to its knees. The prisoners were from many different countries, and executions were carried out on a daily basis there, with different prisoners being shot inside the firing range. The gas chambers were also used at Stutthof, and some inmates almost drowned in mud and were clubbed to death by the prison guards. In total, around 65,000 people were killed in the camp, and many of these were killed by the forced labour they were made to complete. However, one of the women who worked at Stutthof and was drafted to work at the camp was Eva Paradies, who had a terrible reputation amongst the prisoner population. She was born on the 17th of December 1920 in Leborg in the Weimar Republic, and it's not known completely what her early life was like. It's believed though that she was an ardent Nazi, and she then in August 1944 arrived at Stutthof for her training, alongside a number of other women. She was training to become an Aufseherin or an overseer of the women's camp and the women prisoners. When she finished her training, she became a wardress. Whilst at Stutthof, she became known for being immensely brutal and barbaric, and she often beat inmates with her whip and with other weapons. One witness said of one incident that she ordered a group of female prisoners to undress in the freezing cold of winter, and then douse them with ice-cold water. When the women moved, Paradies beat them. This sort of punishment was very common inside of the concentration camps, and was often linked to punishing many inmates at once inside of a barrack, if one person committed a slight infraction of the rules. But Eva Paradies continued to brutalise and beat inmates, and she was then at some point transferred to the Bromberg subcamp for a brief period of time, until she was then transferred back to the main Stutthof camp. But then in April 1945, she was part of the mass transports of prisoners out of Stutthof, as the Allies and the Red Army were on the horizon. She was part of the last transport of women prisoners to the Lauenburg concentration camp, but during the death march she fled, and she knew that she would be brought to trial at the end of the Second World War. She tried to hide out for as long as she could, but she was then captured. She was imprisoned and interrogated for a short period, was then transferred to the Stutthof trials, and she was one of 16 defendants who were accused of being involved in horrors at the camp. The courtroom imposed a number of death sentences on a number of women who had served at the camp, and Eva Paradies was one woman who was condemned to death. But on the 4th of July 1946, at the age of just 25, Eva Paradies was taken to Biskupia Gorka in Gdansk. On a huge hill, a huge set of gallows were created, and was standing to take the lives of those guards who worked at Stutthof. The former guards were brought out in front of 20,000 people who had gathered to witness the executions, and on a huge central triple gallows, Johann Paus, the former commandant, and another female guard, Gerda Steinhoff, were hanged. But on the gallows to the side, Eva Paradies and Wanda Barkmann, two young women who were known for their brutality, were brought out on a truck. The pair had been sat on a stool on the truck, and then the executioners came forward. One of them placed a noose around Eva Paradies' neck, and then final preparations were made with the noose around her neck. She was stood on a stool, and then slowly the truck drove off, and Eva was left hanging from the gallows. It took a number of minutes for her to be pronounced dead, as she slowly strangled to death as the crowds looked on. Eva Paradies was just 25 years old when she was executed by the short drop method, and with her were 10 other guards from Stutthof and Carpos, who were put to death that day. She was a woman who struck fear into the hearts of the prisoners of Stutthof, and her actions contributed to the large death toll at the site. But along with women such as Wanda Barkmann, Elisabeth and Irma Grazer, she was one of a number of young women who turned to the brutality inside of the concentration camps. Elisabeth Becker was born on the 20th of July 1923, and she was born in Nutteich in Gdansk. Her family were German, and as the Nazis came to power, she would then join the League of German Girls. This was the girls' wing of the Nazi Party, and it was the only female youth organisation in Nazi Germany. The membership for young women was compulsory, and at its height there were over 4.5 million members. The BDM, as it was known, would indoctrinate and brainwash girls into Nazi beliefs and systems. They would also train them for their roles in German society as wives, mothers and housewives. This is what Hitler wanted, women to have as many children for his Reich and Empire as possible, who would then be loyal to the dictator and his party. The girls would be forced to learn Nazi songs and sing them. They were also forced to conduct physical education, including track and field. They would also take part in huge sports days. The League of German Girls would even try to discourage the girls to ignore any rebellion against their parents, and they wanted them to be more loyal to the Nazis than their own family. Girls also were required to conduct a year of land service, where they would work on farms and also in other roles to show their loyalty to the Nazis. During the outbreak of the Second World War, the girls were told that the invasion of Poland was justified to punish those people who were considered subhuman. The propaganda, they were told, was ramped up, and because of this a number of girls who were part of the group would want to pursue a career inside of the Nazi Party's industries, such as the SS and inside of the concentration camps. One example of this was Irma Grazer, who would be known as a beautiful beast, and her involvement in the League of German Girls would cause her father to throw her out of the family home, but she would become more loyal to Hitler than her own family. She later joined the concentration camp labour force and became a notorious guard. Other girls would volunteer for the German war effort as nurses and aides inside hospitals, and some even served as anti-aircraft defenders, working as flak helpers and searchlight operators. Elisabeth Becker, as mentioned, would join this group at the age of 13, where she was very impressionable, and she would become a devoted Nazi, it is believed. It's likely her family would also be Nazis, but in 1938, when she was just 15, she would go and work as a conductor on the tramways in Gdansk, her hometown. In 1940, she was also then employed in different firms and businesses, and she also worked as an agriculture assistant. All of her roles and jobs were inside of her hometown of Gdansk, and she did not stray too far from home and from family life. But then as the war turned against the Nazis and the Germans, and with a shortage of local men to work inside of the concentration camps, the SS placed adverts around local towns and cities to appeal to German women to train as concentration camp guards. Many women inside of Gdansk answered the call, and one of these was Elisabeth Becker. She may have actually been called up for service too, being requested to work inside of the camps, and she may have also had little choice. However, where she would work would be Stutthof. Stutthof Concentration Camp was created following the invasion of Poland, and it was a place where many Polish people would be housed inside of following the invasion. It became a concentration camp in 1942, and the original camp was surrounded by barbed wire, and it had 8 barracks filled with inmates. But then it was enlarged heavily, and a new site containing 30 new barrack buildings was made, and also a crematoria and a gas chamber was added in 1943. This was to make sure that the execution of prisoners could take place as efficiently and as quickly as possible. 150 people at a time could be held inside of the gas chamber at the site. The camp staff was made up of many men, but also a number of women who worked there. Women such as Irma Beilhardt, Hertha Bothar, and Wanda Barkmann would become notorious for their treatment of inmates at Stutthof. But as time went on, there were huge transports of women and men who were sent from camps such as Auschwitz. The conditions there were very harsh, and dozens of thousands of people succumbed to starvation and the disease epidemics that were sweeping through the site. Executions were also carried out at Stutthof, and many dozens of prisoners were shot at the site, with thousands being slaughtered also inside of the gas chamber. But Stutthof's inmates would also suffer at the hands of the medical staff, who would inject sick inmates with phenol, killing them, and the guards would also violently beat prisoners to death. The forced labour that the inmates were made to conduct was also horrific, and the prisoners were given insufficient rations for the roles they were doing. Elisabeth Becker would inside of Stutthof become known for being a brutal guard, and despite being in her early 20s, many women who were guarded by her would not even want to look at her in the eyes. She was a woman who was an ardent Nazi, and in particular involved in the selections of inmates. During this process, there would be doctors and guards who would look for the weakest inmates, and those who were then selected were quickly transported to the gas chambers, where they were killed. Elisabeth was involved in this every single day, and her actions led to many women and children being sent to their deaths, and she was deciding who would live and who would die every single day. Many female guards were brought to trials at the end of the Second World War, and they would be condemned due to their actions in the selections. But Becker continued to work at Stutthof as a guard until she ran away and fled on the 15th of January 1945. She was concerned that she may fall into the hands of the enemies, but some guards who accompanied prisoners on death marches would slaughter the former inmates. Becker had only been at Stutthof for around 4 months, and she returned home in January 1945. But 3 months later she was then arrested by the Polish police, and she was then placed in prison to await her trial. She was a defendant in the first Stutthof trial in Gdansk, and this sought to punish the guards who worked at the site. Along with Elisabeth Becker, there were 5 other women, including Wanda Barkmann, who was brought in front of a judge. Many witnesses came forward with their testimony, and they named Elisabeth as someone who exhibited brutality in front of other inmates, and she was linked to the selections of prisoners who went to their deaths in the gas chambers. Elisabeth Becker was then sentenced to death, and she would at her trial confess that she selected at least 30 women to be sent to the gas chambers and be killed. Following her death sentence, Elisabeth Becker then sent a number of letters of appeal to the Polish president for clemency, and the court at the time, on review, considered reducing her death sentence to 15 years imprisonment, as her actions were considered not as severe as other women, such as Gerda Steinhoff and Jenny Barkmann. However, Elisabeth Becker had also been at the camp for the shortest amount of time, but the Polish president would not issue a pardon, and along with the other condemned guards, Elisabeth Becker was brought in front of a huge crowd for her execution on the 4th of July 1946. Biskupia Gorka was the location of the executions of the guards of Stutthof. This was a huge hill, and on this were a number of gallows, huge wooden execution structures, where the guards would be hanged on. On the hill were also 200,000 people who were there to witness the proceedings. Elisabeth Becker was brought out with the other guards, and she was then told to climb on top of a truck, in which many executioners and officials were stood on. One of these then read out the death sentence, and the preparations were made as the truck was backed up under the gallows. A rope and a noose was placed around the gallows, then an executioner helped Elisabeth onto a step, then the noose was placed around her neck. All the final checks took place, and after this, the truck drove off and Elisabeth was left on the scaffold and on the gallows, and within minutes she was executed and declared dead, high above the huge crowd. Elisabeth Becker, at the day of her death, was just 22, but she was a woman who had exhibited much cruelty and brutality onto people who were suffering. She was a woman who was responsible for the deaths of at least 30 women, and she was spotted selecting many people to go to their deaths in the gas chambers. Despite the calls for clemency, she was considered a brutal guard who was brainwashed by the Nazis through her education and the youth groups she was forced to join. However, she was a war criminal at the end of the day, and her actions contributed to the executions of others, and this is why the court in Poland believed she deserved to die. 200,000 people saw her execution that day on the hill in Gdansk and Gdansk. Born on the 30th of May 1922, Jenny Wanda Barkmann was born in Hamburg, and she had a rather modest upbringing. She was raised by her father, who was a dock worker, and the family did not always have too much money, as her mother was a housewife. As a child, Jenny was a normal girl, and she dreamt of becoming an actress. Following her schooling, she tried to become a fashion model, and Jenny was noted for her good looks and appearance, but the outbreak of the Second World War did not change her plans, and she continued to be involved in photo shoots for German magazines and also in different advertising agencies. But then at some point at the start of 1944, something changed in the life of Jenny Wanda Barkmann. Suddenly she quit her modelling career, and then she appealed to an advertisement which was issued by the German SS, and they said they needed women to work inside of the concentration camps. Many women were recruited to work inside of the evil sites, and some went for money, and some wanted a complete change in their life. At the time, Jenny Wanda Barkmann was just around 21, and she probably wanted the money, and also the idea of career advancement, or she may have been obsessed with the idea of wielding power over others. She was interviewed for the job, and she passed this interview, and then she trained to become an overseer or an Aufseherin inside of a concentration camp. She was then transferred to the Stutthof Concentration Camp, which was known for being a very brutal site. At Stutthof in Gdansk, there were 110,000 inmates who were held within the barbed wire fences, and 65,000 people would never make it out alive. The camp was staffed by SS guards and also Ukrainian auxiliaries, and the first female guards at Stutthof were brought in during 1942, and a total of 295 women would work there. Stutthof had a huge number of prisoners come from different countries, and the conditions there were very harsh. Thousands of prisoners died from starvation and disease, and lots died from typhus epidemics that swept through the camp in winter 1942 and also 1944, and many inmates were too sick to work, and they were then sent to the camp's small gas chamber. Executions were carried out on a daily basis, with prisoners being shot on the firing range and also being sent to the gas chambers. Others were executed on gallows during roll call to strike fear into the hearts of the inmates. Others were injected with phenol, and the prisoners sometimes were beaten to death by the guards, and some even drowned in the mud. Many prisoners were rented out by other companies for slave labour, and Stutthof became infamous for its evil. Jenny Barkmann, as soon as she arrived, showed her evil and brutal side, and she had a talent for cruelty and sadism. She was known for beating inmates almost to death, and then sending them to the gas chambers. She would torture prisoners in different ways, and some of these actions even shocked the other guards. People believed that she was fragile and intelligent when she was still a very young woman, but she then became known as Mad Jenny, and also the Beautiful Spectre. It's believed that she had dozens of victims, and she would also take part in selections, where they were taken to the gas chambers on a daily basis. It's believed she was responsible for the deaths of many, and she killed with her own hands through violent beatings. She also sent many children as well as women to their deaths, but as the Second World War was coming to an end, Mad Jenny sought to try and escape justice. As the Soviet Red Army were on the horizon, she ran off, and Jenny Barkmann became one of the most hunted war criminals before the war had come to an end. She managed to evade capture for a while, before in May 1945 she was arrested as she was boarding a train in Gdansk to leave. She had been helped while she was hiding for some time, but the image of Jenny Barkmann had been kept in the records of the camp, and prisoners remembered her well, and the description of Jenny was sent all over Europe to try and find her. But following her interrogation, she said she had always treated the prisoners of Stutthof well, and that she had never killed or ill-treated the inmates. She also said that she helped some who were suffering and were starving, and also that some had been saved from death by her. But the descriptions of her antics and what she was saying did not add up, and one prison guard was even fooled by her lies. This man began to sympathise with her, and she begged this guard to let her out of her prison cell for a few hours. But when the guard saw the inmates and her victims, he did not let her out ever again. Jenny Wanda Barkmann was brought to the Stutthof trials, and at trial dozens of prisoners from the camp testified against her. Documents were also brought forward showing and portraying her evil, and her lawyer tried to make a case that she was insane and was not fit enough to stand trial. He claimed that she did not have the capacity to make sound decisions and that she was insane. However, she did not come across crazy at all. Jenny spent most of her time at the trial flirting with guards and bothering more about her hair than the evils that she had committed whilst at the camp when she worked there. She would laugh in the face of witnesses, but for her crimes she was sentenced to death. When this was announced, she did not cry, and she listened to it calmly. However, the final words of her court case were, "Life is really a great pleasure, and pleasure, as a rule, does not last long." On the 4th of July 1946, early in the morning, Jenny Wanda Barkmann, along with the 10 other convicted war criminals, were taken to a site of execution on the Biskupia Gorka Hill near Gdansk. On these hills were huge gallows which had been constructed to execute the former guards of Stutthof. Over 200,000 people were there to witness the proceedings, and Jenny was then brought out in front of the crowd, and she was helped onto the back of a truck. The executioners were stood with her. They then sat her down on a stool whilst the adjustments to the noose were made. Then Jenny Barkmann was told to stand on the stool. Then the noose was fastened around her neck. Shortly after this, the truck drove off, and Jenny Wanda Barkmann was left on the gallows, and within minutes, the horrific war criminal, with thousands looking on, was declared dead. Jenny Wanda Barkmann was just 24 when she was executed on the gallows for her crimes at Stutthof Concentration Camp. She would have dreamed of a career modelling or being an actress. However, the lure of a brutal life wielding power and violence over people was too much for her to resist. Inside of Stutthof, she became known for her evil antics and actions, and she was also known for her cruelty, in which she ordered many executions and carried killing out with her bare hands. She was a woman who became notorious alongside other guards of the Holocaust, such as Irma Grazer, Johanna Bormann, and Elisabeth Volkenrath, for their terrible actions and sadism. But what drove her to enter a world dominated by the evil of the SS? Still today her motives are not entirely known. Gerda Steinhoff was born on the 29th of January 1922 inside of Gdansk or Gdansk. She had a normal upbringing, and while she was a teenager she worked as a housemaid on a farm near to her home. But then following leaving school from 1939, she worked inside of a bakery in Gdansk, but then Gerda took a new job working on the trams as a conductor. As the Second World War was waging on, she continued working in Gdansk and got married in 1944, and then she had a child. However, that year she also answered the call that the Nazis put out, asking for new guards to work inside of the concentration camps. They asked inside of many towns, as many former guards had been drafted to the front lines to fight the Soviets and the Allies, as the war had turned against the Germans. However, Gerda Steinhoff then trained at the Stutthof Concentration Camp near to her home, and she would join the staff there after a short period of training. On the 1st of October 1944, Gerda Steinhoff became a block lighter in, or a block leader, who was in control of a group or block of women and prisoners. Stutthof, where she worked, was a camp which opened following the German invasion of Poland, and as soon as the Germans invaded, people were being rounded up and were sent there. The first inmates were there to build the camp, and they built the barrack buildings, and Stutthof changed over a number of years, until in 1942 it became a concentration camp. The initial site was surrounded by barbed wire fences, and there were 8 barracks and also a bunkhouse for SS guards, and then the camp got bigger and grew to a huge capacity, with a new site being made next to the old one. The new camp had 30 barracks and also a crematorium and gas chambers, which were added, and the final solution was carried out at Stutthof. The camp staff was made up of German SS guards, and as mentioned, many people including women were enlisted at the site to work and to manage the women prisoners. Alongside Gerda Steinhoff were other women such as Paradies, Jenny Wanda Barkmann and Gerda Steinhoff. The prisoners of Stutthof came from a number of countries, and a huge number of them were sent from Auschwitz and were deported there to work. The conditions at the camp were incredibly tough though, and dozens of thousands of prisoners died from starvation and disease which went around Stutthof, with typhus epidemics sweeping through the camp in winter 1942, and also in 1944. The prisoners who were considered too weak to work were then sent to the small gas chambers at Stutthof, with thousands dying inside the chamber before they were taken to the crematorium. Executions were carried out there on a daily basis, and also doctors took the lives of weak inmates using phenol injections, and also a number of prisoners were drowned in the mud by the guards and were beaten to death with weapons. Prisoners were shipped out for forced labour at a number of Nazi businesses who helped the war effort, and these prisoners were forced to work incredibly hard. An aircraft factory was even created at Stutthof, and there were a number of subcamps also. But then as the war was coming to an end, the evacuation of Stutthof took place. Around 50,000 prisoners were shipped out of the camp, and many were marched towards the sea, and once they arrived there, German SS guards executed them as they marched into the sea, shooting them with their machine guns. This happened a number of times, and then further executions on death marches took place, with it's believed 25,000 prisoners dying during the evacuation effort. Gerda Steinhoff was a guard at Stutthof who got involved in the killing process, and she became known for taking part in prisoner selections, and she would also send many to their deaths in the gas chambers. The Nazis valued her horrific work, and she was then promoted to an SS Oberaufseherin and was considered a senior female guard, and she was a senior overseer, and other women served underneath her. She was on the 1st of December 1944 reassigned to another subcamp at Stutthof, but one of these was the Bromberg Ost camp, found 105 miles south of Gdansk. Whilst here she received a medal for her service to the Nazi Reich, but Steinhoff was also known for being a brutal and savage overseer who would whip and beat the prisoners, but whilst the evacuations were taking place, Gerda Steinhoff decided to flee Stutthof in the subcamp, and she returned home to her family life. But the authorities would soon catch up with her. Following the liberation of the camp, a number of guards were arrested following guard lists being found, and Gerda Steinhoff was arrested by Polish officials on the 25th of May 1945. She was then interrogated and was tried in the first Stutthof trial, along with many other SS female guards and staff, and during the trial many witnesses came forward about her actions at various subcamps. They told of her brutal beatings, and also that she was involved in the selections with prisoners being sent to their deaths, and she was considered a sadist who would assault and abuse inmates on an hourly basis. But what surprised the judges was that Steinhoff had been a guard for only around a year, but then the war would come to an end, but in just this short time she got involved in a number of horrific crimes, and at the end of the day she was just a 24-year-old young mother who caused immense brutality. But along with a number of other women, she was sentenced to death for her involvement in the selections and in crimes against humanity. Gerda Steinhoff was then imprisoned for a short time, until on the 4th of July 1946 she was taken to Biskupia Gorka Hill in Gdansk, which was a huge mound. On this hill stood a number of huge wooden gallows, where they would be executed on, and the female guards were led out in front of the crowd. Gerda Steinhoff and the other condemned men and women were taken out and were told to climb on a number of trucks. Gerda Steinhoff was helped onto the vehicle, and then was told to sit on a stool on the back whilst a noose was thrown over the gallows and was prepared. The executioner then read out the death sentence, and she was then stood on the stool, and the noose was secured around her neck. And then the guards gave the instructions for the trucks to drive off. The rope then went taut, and then Gerda Steinhoff was executed and was left on the gallows in front of the huge crowd, and she was executed on the same gallows as the male head guard, Johann Pauls. Gerda Steinhoff was, despite her age, a senior guard at Stutthof Concentration Camp, and she was just 24 when she was executed in front of a huge crowd. She was a woman who was also not there too long, but she was known for her violence that resulted in a number of inmates being killed, and she also selected prisoners to go to their deaths. For this she was found guilty of crimes against humanity, and she is remembered alongside other evil female guards, such as Elisabeth Falkenrath, Irma Grazer, Johanna Bormann, as one of the most despicable war criminals of the Second World War. Stutthof Concentration Camp opened its gates almost as soon as World War II broke out, with the German invasion of Poland. The camp was established by a number of Polish prisoners who had been listed as needing arrest, and these first victims became the people who made the buildings in the different barracks. They even had to build where they would sleep. But as the war went on, there were a large amount of prisoners who would be transferred and sent to Stutthof, and especially as the war turned against the Germans, the prisoner population would grow. In 1944, the number of inmates rose, and many of the new prisoners were Jewish inmates who had been sent from camps such as Auschwitz. 24,000 prisoners were sent from Auschwitz, and to cope with the large amount of people transferred, more guards were brought to the camp. Some SS guards of Stutthof had been conscripted into the war effort, so officials looked towards a local area to recruit guards and staff who would become brutes inside of the camp. This included a number of women, but the conditions as the camp numbers grew broke down. There was a huge overcrowding problem, and disease spread quickly around the site, killing many inmates. And also there was a huge lack of food, and starvation was also a problem. The prisoners came from many different countries, and the guards were carrying out killings and executions on a daily basis. Prisoners were being executed on the gallows in front of other inmates, and the conditions of the camp were made worse, with the fact that mud was everywhere. Some inmates even drowned in the mud, and beatings were administered by a number of guards who brutalised the prisoners. But in total around 65,000 prisoners were killed in the camp, and many were exterminated through the forced labour they were made to do. Wanda Klaff was born on the 6th of March 1922, and she was from Danzig or Gdansk, where Stutthof was situated nearby. She was born Wanda Klaff, and her parents were both German, and her father worked on the railways. At some point the family changed their name to Kalden in 1941 during the Second World War for some reason, but Wanda, it's believed, had a very normal schooling and upbringing. After she finished school at the age of 16 in 1938, she then worked inside of a jam factory, even as the war was waging on. She remained there until 1942, and at the age of 20 she then married a man named Willy Klaff, and she left work to become a housewife for a brief time. But as the couple needed money, Wanda then went back to work as a streetcar operator. However, in the local area of Gdansk, the SS put out advertisements looking for men and women to work inside of the concentration camps. They would not take everyone, and they were picky and wanted Aryans to work inside the camp, but Wanda Klaff then answered the call, and she was, in 1944, sent to Stutthof. She completed her training there, with more senior guards schooling a number of women on how to become brutes. Klaff, following her training, was then sent to Stutthof's subcamp, named Proust, which was found in a small town nearby. This was where many women prisoners were based, and whilst here she would beat, whip and assault many of the women that were held there. Following a short stint at Proust, she was then on the 5th of October 1944 transferred to the Russischen subcamp, which was found in a small village. This small subcamp imprisoned around 300 women, who were forced to conduct hard labour. If the women could not complete their work, then Klaff and the other female guards would beat them brutally, and the women were savaged by other guards. It was only a very small camp with around 300 prisoners, so a very few select number of female guards were based there. But as the Soviet forces were approaching Stutthof, a large number of evacuations took place. The remaining prisoners of around 50,000 were marched towards different places, and many were marched towards the sea, where they were shot in the water by machine guns which were set up on the shore. It's believed that around 25,000 prisoners were killed during the evacuations of Stutthof and the other subcamps, but for some of the guards, the evacuations served as a means of escaping the site, and also escaping the crimes that they had committed inside of the concentration camp. It was likely that they knew after the war trials would be brought against those who treated the inmates horrifically and committed crimes in various concentration camps. Wanda Klaff used the evacuations in early 1945 as a way of escaping the camp and trying to evade justice. However, on the 11th of June 1945, she was arrested and was held inside of a Polish prison. However, the conditions at this site were also rather poor, and because of this she became very ill in prison from typhoid fever. But she did survive, and she was then brought to the Stutthof trials to stand against charges of crimes against humanity. Alongside her were a number of other women, including Wanda Barkmann, Gerda Steinhoff and Elisabeth Becker. All of these women were accused of crimes against humanity, and of treating the inmates of Stutthof brutally and horrifically. Wanda Klaff was accused of hitting and beating inmates on a daily basis, and she admitted her crimes at the trial, was incredibly smug about what she had done. She said, "I am very intelligent and very devoted to my work in the camps. I struck at least 2 prisoners each day." It's not known why she admitted this, and it may have been a brag, as it would have been unlikely that the judges would have seen her favourably with this admission. However, along with many other former guards and a number of other women, Wanda Klaff was sentenced to death in the Stutthof trials, and she was condemned to death at just the age of 24. After the war, many authorities found it strange how such young women could become such brutes. On the 4th of July 1946, she was taken from her prison cell to Biskupia Gorka, a huge hill in Gdansk. Inside this area, 20,000 people had gathered to witness the executions of the former guards of Stutthof. At the age of just 24, Wanda Klaff was led out, was then ordered to climb onto the back of a truck. On these trucks were a number of guards and officials, and there was also a stool. Wanda Klaff was told to sit on the stool, then the truck reversed back under the huge gallows that had been placed on the hill. These gallows were massive and allowed everyone in the crowd to get a glimpse of the proceedings. Wanda Klaff was then stood on the stool as a noose was thrown over the gallows, and it was then secured around her neck. Slowly then the officials got off the truck, and then the truck went forward and Wanda Klaff swung from the gallows. Within minutes she was executed, and she was left hanging for a while, until she was declared dead by a doctor. Wanda Klaff was a woman who at the age of 24 was sentenced to death, and she was a woman who worked inside of the concentration camp for around a year. There were longer serving guards and women at other sites that were never brought to justice for their evils, but on the hill, on a huge set of gallows in Gdansk, Wanda Klaff was sentenced to death and was executed. She was one of a number of women at Stutthof who were condemned for their crimes, but the huge crowd of 20,000 that day saw all the executions. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.